Right, we're going to hear today, as you can see on your program, from folks who work in resource companies, in aid agencies, representatives of local communities affected by mining, as well as academics. And we're going to explore and debate the latest thinking on how to reduce poverty and conflict in resource nations and talk about legacy. What is the legacy that resource projects can leave behind, and how do you secure that? And I think what we're really circling is the question, what is a resources company? Forgive me if that sounds stupid. Yes, it extracts minerals, it builds roads and bridges, it has a role in the community, but what is it in context? And I think that's at base the question that the industry and its stakeholders have been exploring for some time. We're going to explore it all day today. We could frankly be here all week thinking about it. And so perhaps rather than answer that question, we're going to reflect on it today. What ought a resource company be, and therefore what does best practice look like? So the volunteers here are going to start with a broad brush discussion to set up our day. The theme of this first panel discussion is best practice mining for development. So we're going to begin, and I'll ask them some questions and give them the opportunity to say what they've come here to say, but I'd really like to encourage everybody to have a think about what questions and comments you'd like to make as well. We have about an hour 20 for each of our panel discussions. And so there's plenty of time for your comments and thoughts. And so we'll come around the floor with microphones and so forth. And if you just have any thoughts and questions, we'd ask you to contribute those, because I do find that sometimes the best conversations go on over coffee outside, and if we can corral that back inside, that'd be great. So I'll quickly introduce our panellists. The full details are in your programs. We have Dick Kell, a consultant in emerging markets at Cardno. Another of our panellists on this end, Dr. Helen Zoke, CEO of Oxfam Australia, was joking that Dick's a bit of a fly-by-night, really, just quite new to the industry. How many years, Dick? 50? Oh, don't mention 53. All right. John Richards is the head of corporate affairs with Anglo American, and Ford Murray has worked in community relations for resources companies and done human rights and community development audits globally. And so I thought we'd begin with you, Helen, if we can. Is this one on, John? You have a very challenging message for industry, and that is that how can I put it simply, you've got to go beyond compliance. If compliance requires A to D, Oxfam says you should go all the way to Z. You can't operate discreetly, and mining companies should be responsible for, I think you wrote, tackling inequality, corruption and tax justice. Is that all? That seems like a lot.
Well, I think the message is that they're well positioned to do that. It's interesting, Ellen, we've got a cartoon up on the screen there, and Oxfam recently launched a report on inequality, and I think the statistics that are demonstrated in that report are quite chilling in terms of what's actually happening to the world's poorest people. And what we're seeing is that there is a concentration of wealth, and there's a huge disparity between those who are accumulating wealth and, I guess, the world's poor are getting poorer. Now, many of those people are in the countries where the extractive industries are operating, and so, in a sense, if the extractive industries are gaining benefits in a broad sense, then the issue is it does go beyond compliance in terms of what they give back, I suppose, in terms of best practice in their operations. So I think our message is not that the extractive industries have to solve poverty or have to tackle inequality, but the machinery around that in terms of the obligations in relation to transparency, in relation to taxation regimes, in relation to how interactions occur with local communities are really critical to make sure that problems aren't exacerbated. And because extractive industries are so much a part of many of these countries where there are the world's poorest people, there is a critical role that they play, and we would argue that there's a critical benefit that they get by playing that role.
And so when you say that they should flex their muscles in this way, how far does that extend in your mind?
Well, I think what we're talking about is going the whole journey. So it extends to from the ground up in terms of what interactions there are with local communities about negotiating where mines will be and what the arrangements are where people have to be relocated, or where communities are disrupted, or where there's an ongoing relationship with communities. It extends in terms of the nature of agreements that are made with governments. And for many of the mining companies, we're aware there are enormous challenges around the nature of that relationship with some governments where the best principles of transparency and democracy aren't exemplified. But where there are payments made to governments, ideally there should be transparency, so there's some accountability within countries about what benefits go back to communities. It goes to the issues of what we talk about in terms of free, prior, informed consent. Saying, giving agreements is about an informed decision. It's about communities being empowered. I think the opening video was a really inspiring aspiration, and I congratulate Cardno for, I guess, having the courage to actually use the language of empowerment, because it's much more than consultation, it's much more than paying lip service, and that's really the kind of full gamut of where we think things should be going. Where's Ellen gone?
I'm here. I'm sorry about that. Don't worry, I won't leave.
No, that's okay.
I give you that assurance. I will not leave.
I think the only other thing I'd say is that, Oxfam is obviously a global organisation that operates across the world in many of these countries where the mining companies are, but it's not only our data that's really highlighting the challenges of inequality and poverty and, really bringing these things to our attention. So there's an objective case that has to be answered globally.
And John, I want to come to you next. Helen's made a very clear statement here in this briefing document. Support for best mining practice and mining for development means you must tackle inequality, corruption and tax justice. Does that make you blanch as the person who's on the front line dealing with government?
No, not at all, Helen. It's probably the exact opposite, because I think all mining companies, or certainly Anglo American as a mining company, wants to do that. It's a matter of getting a structure to tackle those issues, because you do need transparency, both to show your investors that you're doing the right thing, to show the communities. You do need engagement, and I agree, it's going past just what the government wants you to do, because all the government really wants you to do is make sure that royalties get into the coffers and that you build some infrastructure. You have to make sure that you're doing what the community wants as well, so that you're doing what you need to do, you're paying the government what they want in a transparent way, and you're also making sure the communities have what they want. And we have something, a toolbox, if you like, around that identifies those issues, targets those funds, and delivers an outcome that the community wants, besides a regulatory outcome that the government needs.
Yeah. So in your mind then, and this is, Dick and I were talking about this, where does the role of the mining company end and the sovereign government begin, or do you think that that's a blurry line?
As far as Anglo is concerned, we want to be the partner of choice for the communities where we operate, and we want to be the partner of choice of government. So we work with the government, for example, in Botswana, where now De Beers is based. We work with them on how do we develop the talent pool within their country. We have a graduate program, and how do we start up micro and medium level businesses that help us through our supply chain. Do we do political donations? No, we don't offer political donations to any political party in any of our jurisdictions, whether it's Australia, South Africa, Canada, South America. So it's not handing the money over. It's a matter of getting a transparent system where we can make sure the government gets its royalties while the communities also benefit.
And just to labour the point, so when you go in for a meeting,
yep,
who are you? You're coming in, are you talking about the Anglo-American project? Are you talking about development for that nation? Are you hoping to be a partner to the government minister you're talking to, a mentor to the government minister you're talking to, or a lobbyist for the company you work for?
All of the above, I think, Ellen, because they're all linked together. I'll use an example here in New South Wales. In New South Wales, if I may. We've got a small mine there. Okay, we're trying to get an extension for that mine. We pay $35 million a year in royalties to the government. Okay, we want to extend the mine, but we also need to bring the community along with us. So we're looking at programs through our toolbox to assist the community. That makes the government more comfortable that we're listening to the community needs, therefore it moves through the regulatory process and we get a project up. So it's all of that, Helen, but it's not brown paper bags. I think those days are gone. Certainly they're never there for Anglo-American, but it's making sure that we're the partner of choice for communities, the partner of choice for government, because everyone wants to have a lasting, positive legacy from the minerals industry.
Now, Ford, do you have a microphone? You do. That's great. I want you to put your particular perspective on this. I mean, you go into any setting in any country, and there'll be a compliance framework that will set out time and how time is to unfold, how much time is to be taken in consultation, the time that will be taken for approvals, and all the rest of it. And if you step through that process, is that adequate? If you say, well, that's the framework for time, and we'll do our best practice within that, is that acceptable? Is that enough?
If you consider that communities manage the stewardship of their patch in perpetuity, and a resource company is only in that patch for a finite period of time in that time scale of perpetuity, it's perhaps a different way to look at it. So the amount of time you spend at the front end has to have durability of context and management through to up to during operation and post-closure.
Yeah, but the piece of paper here says I only got to do it for 90 days.
There's a lot of
spend longer?
There's a lot of time spent on that 90 days to get the approval, and in that time, which is often legislated in countries within a law, and remember that the law is the floor level of moral conduct, if you like. That's the guidance. You're allowed to go beyond that and go beyond that compliance and consider when a community actually grasps what its future may look like with a proponent's presence. And in that respect, the free, prior, informed consent, the consent bit, is very, very important. Because when I consent to do something, or any of us consent to do something, the understanding of what you're consenting to at a certain point in time may vary 2 years hence or 5 years hence. And it also changes when a proponent, through circumstances beyond itself, implements rapid, large-scale change, upwards or downwards. It doubles the footprint, it halves the footprint, it indefinitely suspends, it abandons the project, and the whole psychological contract around the politics of hope, which have gone into the conversation, particularly around the event of approval, dissipates.
And so if you understand that, and if that's your worldview going in, that these are the people who manage it for perpetuity, and this is what has to happen to even begin to imagine that consent can be given, how do you act differently then?
I think what companies increasingly must do, or proponents, is must have a regard for a community's resilience to change. Change at the entry, change in the middle where there's integration, and change on exit. For example, the hard rock mining sector is really very focused on mine closure. That's about the pit, the thing, the hole in the ground, the rehabilitation. It seldom is about the psychological contract and the expectation. For that is what is often when there's closure, you know, it's the conversation within the proponent of the mining company is about what's our contractual obligations, what was the deal with government, what did we say we were going to do. And all of that change about real estate markets, job losses, how local government might feel is often at exit or sudden rapid large-scale change is not well thought through. So as a minimum, I think that community relations people and practitioners need to tutor, reverse engineer the tutoring within their companies, the need to have a plan for if there's rapid, large-scale change, and what one needs to do to understand the community at that time, at that point on that watch's ability to cope, its resilience, and what the company needs to do to go in and help that community with that change.
Can I come to you, Dick, and be a little provocative? So we're talking about all of this. Now let's take the example of Australia. I don't want to debate the merits of the super profits tax, but the super profits tax in Australia was said to deliver a more equitable share of the boom to the folks who own the ore in the ground, and that's the Australian people. That's what it was said to do on those occasions where a mining company made super profits. Now, even here, you saw the sector acting in their own interests to lobby against that tax. So, again, I don't want to debate the merits of that. But why would you expect a resources company operating in the developing world to put national interest ahead of its own interests when clearly they've got a responsibility to shareholders, and we see the behaviour, again, I don't want to debate the merits of it, around a super profits tax in Australia?
Yes, perhaps with Fergus here representing Andrew Forrest, I won't go to the super profits tax in Australia. It is a very interesting point to consider, but the fact that mining is international is shown up by Jim's comments. He cited briefly two Anglo-American projects, one in Botswana and one in New South Wales. And basically the approach from that company to relating to the community to gain success for the two projects he cited was the same, because communities will react the same regardless of where they are. And I think that clearly if mining projects and the associated infrastructure that goes with them are properly planned and constructed, they'll add to the social wealth of the country, and will benefit local communities beyond the economic benefit which to the country, which should be realised from the mine itself via the royalties that accrue to the government. And on the other hand, there are ample examples where the mining development and the infrastructure have not been integrated with the local community, and that has resulted in social unrest and environmental degradation and long-term conflict. So I think that from that point of view alone, the mining company wherever should take the view that it's in their interest, in order to get a mine operating which is accepted by the community and to a degree welcomed by the community, they should take the community in. Of course, that's apart from the fact that they should be good corporate citizens. I think there are the matter of best practice mining. It could be considered at two levels, and that theme's been taken up by my colleagues. One is at the high level, which is the government and the mining company and its financiers, and it deals with governance and the legalities, the agreements reached between them, and it should be based on best practice protocols and models, since, for example, those espoused by Oxfam or taken up by Anglo-American, and it would be based on principles of collaboration and sustainability and integrity and transparency and transparency and transparency. But then there is the second level, which is the coalface, and I guess that's the area that I've mainly been in my working life, both in mining and infrastructure projects, and that's where the projects are actually being implemented. And there, of course, the project has to be properly planned and designed, and the engineers and technologists and environmentalists and others and the managers come into their own there. And of course, it goes without saying that the development must meet the objectives of the mining company. It must return a profit to the shareholders, and so it must produce what it's set out to produce. But it must also, in my view, it will succeed only if it engages with the local communities via the stakeholder groups. And as Ford has said, the engagement with those groups is not straightforward, and it should be recognised that it may change. In fact, it is difficult. I've worked in Papua New Guinea, and it's difficult to identify what a stakeholder group can do. I mean, the stakeholder groups can be identified, and there are many of them in the area of a development, because you can have different clans or groups. One talks within 10 or 20 kilometres, and it's necessary to bring them all into the equation, and there may be women's groups and business groups and youth and church groups and a whole range of people. But what can they sign? They should be brought in at the stage of the planning of the project. They should be kept fully informed, and it is quite an appropriate thing to have them at some stage sign something that's saying that, yes, we agree with what is going to be done here.
And we'll come to lots of examples of that. Ford, I just want you to flesh out your idea a little bit more, and maybe have the other panellists reflect on it, if you would. When Dick says that, I think that of your comment, which is time sharing. And so you're sort of talking about a bit of a scary prospect of giving up control, really, giving up some control over time. Why do you think that's the centrepiece?
In a conversation or a negotiation, a transaction for entering an approval, framing an approval with a community, consider who owns time. Is it shared, or is it biased towards one party in the room? Now, the approval process is often legislated and well defined in legislation in countries. If you go to a community leader or just community, lay community people, and you speak to engagement and consultation towards consent, it is that consent is often the understanding of what the future may deliver in challenges, in change, for only that point of time that we're speaking about. And so an approval is granted. But there's very little opportunity beyond triggering the community, triggering an outrage event to get the mind of the proponent and perhaps other stakeholders like government to ask of the proponent to revisit something later because the deal has been done. If the community has that opportunity and that is actually granted and understood in the relationship, that is more towards sharing of time, because time changes. Consider this. We now have mega projects planet-wide where the big end of town talks about basins and provinces for mineral extraction around the world. What do we think of when these decades up to 100 years, consider Olympic Dam, for example, up to 100 years. What do we think of when we think of an approval process in somewhere between 2008 and 2010, and that psychological contract, intergenerational contract in Saskatchewan in Canada, or in the Pilbara, or in Olympic Dam, or in the Andes in Chile, is there a trigger where that can be revisited in 2050 by the community of that day on its watch about an approval? And who has an appetite to do that?
And John, if you started going into Mark Kutafani's office, the head of Anglo-American, Australian fellow, and said, now listen, I've got this idea, we've got to share time. And he says, now hang on, I sent you out to get agreement. I sent you out to get free, prior and informed consent. Didn't you do that part? You say, yeah, but I've got to share time. You see, how will that go? And the lawyer's in the room too, chief counsel's in the room too. And he says, say that part about sharing time again.
Yeah, I'd hope there'd be other people in the room to help me get out of the room, Ellen. Look, I think, and some of that I agree with, but the experience that we've had, both as a company and the communities, is you want certainty in a process, in a planning process. And you want to be able to know and tell your investors and your communities that we're going to start here, and in this time frame we're going to go to here, and this is going to happen, and you're involved in this part and this part and this part. But at the end of a 2-year, 3-year process, and Ellen, they're never on time. The government never has a planning process that delivers on time, which is a huge bugbear for people trying to get projects up. But at the end of the process, they need to know that yes, all these things are being considered, and the decision is X or Y. Either the project goes ahead, thumbs up, or no, the project doesn't go ahead. But I think to have these things floating along endlessly, we might go ahead, we need more studies, we need a bit more of this, a bit more of that, let's talk to these people. It doesn't create any certainty in communities who are trying to either keep their jobs, get jobs, or become part of a supply chain that will look after that project. We need to have, for our investors, for our communities and for the public, faith in a planning process that will deliver an outcome after dealing with all the shareholders and stakeholders.
Well, I actually heard something different in some of these comments, which I think is really important. And from our perspective, we would say this is what experience shows. So I have no problem with certainty, but actually what we're dealing with is people and communities. And one part of the process is the start-up, so we have the concerns around free, prior, informed consent. But there is then a journey along the way, over the decades as a particular company takes extractives or continues to negotiate with communities. And I guess I'd give 2 examples because these companies they're not going into a blank page, they're going into an existing dynamic, existing tensions. And, to use the, Princess Diana kind of quote, there are 3 people in the marriage. Well, there is the government, but often in these countries there are local communities that may not necessarily have their best interests looked after the government. So I'll give 2 examples. The first is actually the Marikana miners' strike in 2012, which was, a tragic event in terms of the loss of life. But from our perspective, what that issue was about was actually the growing disparity of distribution of wealth in that country. It was about stark inequality where people were feeling quite powerless. So irrespective of what the original consents were, it's how the correspondence, how the communication, how the checks and balances around the responsibilities of government as well as the responsibilities of mining companies are put into place, which then raises the question about mandatory requirements around transparency and tax justice. And the second...
And everybody knows that example, I'm sure, of what happened there, that such was the feeling that there wasn't consent. There were uprisings.
There were deaths as a result of it. The other example I'd give, one of my first conferences that I came to, and we've had a lot to do with Rio Tinto in various forms or another. And I think Bruce Harvey's here. And Bruce, you'll be happy to know that I've listened to you, because one of the comments he made was something along the lines of, for mining companies, we have to be listening the whole time. So it's not just about the issues of dislocation, it's not just about the kind of initial consents, but it's about the daily grind of how disruptive extractive industries can be to communities and how you actually deal with that. So whether it's the vibrations on the ground from the trucks or whether it's noise or whatever the case may be. Now, from Oxfam's perspective, the other issue around not just the free, prior, informed consent, but the ongoing dialogue is the power inequality in that conversation. You know, once a company's in there, it's very hard for communities to actually say, well, you know, we consented to this, but this is the impact we're having on our life. We're going to hear from Ume later on, who's going to talk about Papua New Guinea, and I'm sure one of the things she'll talk about is, when mining companies talk to communities, they have to think proactively about how they hear the voices of women who are so critical in communities in terms of generating concern for what happens in the broader community. It's not enough just to go to established groups. You have to take into context what country you're in and what the power imbalances are that already exists on the ground. So I guess from our perspective, we partner with local organisations so that we understand those nuances at a local level. And the other bit about the timeshare that I'm hearing is that this is an ongoing and constantly changing dialogue that has to occur with communities. It's not enough just to have the certainty at the start where we've signed on the line to go in and extract. It's about how we ensure that we're not taking those communities into account or exploiting their interests or not listening to the impact that these companies might be having, unintended, although it might be along the way.
Ellen, I might just add to what Helen says there. I think I mentioned the stakeholders and stakeholder agreements. It's quite normal that the stakeholders don't really have the authority to sign binding agreements, but the signing of some form of agreement basically gives an indication that at a point in time the development was agreed to, and the company, on its part, undertook to provide a number of advantages and benefits for the local community. The major one is in the training and employment of local people, particularly the youth, and not just in labouring jobs, but in youths and I should add, and women, of course, not just in the lower level, but in higher level positions within the mine, and that's only fair and reasonable. But by those kinds of measures, a relationship can be formed where there is support from the community, and I think that's what the mining company has to aim at. And I should add here that in reaching this engagement with the local community, this is really not an engineering matter. This requires the mining company to engage a range of expertise in the social areas, in the gender and equity areas, in health, HIV/AIDS prevention, in education generally and training, in a whole range of areas where they should be, the mining company should be guided by people with those skills who should be allowed to exercise their true professional independence in giving advice. It's in the best interest at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with that, Dick, and I think you need the certainty in getting a project up and for operations to continue, but the community also needs the certainty that it's going to be involved. Taking your local procurement, for example, we have a policy in Anglo-American of 11% of supplies to projects and operations has to be locally. And I'm not talking the Bowen Basin, I'm not talking South Africa as a whole, I'm talking the postcode. So 11% of procurement has to be from that postcode. Now, in a lot of those communities, that's not possible. So how do you get to that? Well, you start dealing with the local trader associations. You bring in the expertise for them to start internet-based, where they can start getting their stuff together to make sure that they've got their own supply chains in line, so there's a lasting legacy when that project's up. The next project that comes along, they'll be in a far better position to take advantage of it. If you're looking at health, we've, as Anglo-Americans, started up a program back in 2003 regarding AIDS in South Africa, looking at anti-retroviral treatment for our staff, offering voluntary scanning, offering education, and that's $10 million a year. Now that's totally different, for example, for the stuff we're doing for health in New South Wales, where it's getting involved with community groups. But that's part of the contract, the social contract you have with organisations and with communities where you're operating in it. And I think most mining companies are fulfilling their regulatory stuff, Helen, that you talked about before, but now they have to go that extra step, and it's seen as well, compulsory, but expected.
What I think is the agenda going forward, beyond the social outreach of programs, that often is channelled by companies, is community self-empowerment. Now, many communities, particularly in first world jurisdictions, aren't really that captured. I've got 2 cars, a boat in the front yard. What do I want to get self-empowered about if I live in Australia? So it can be difficult in first world countries. But in non-first world countries, where there is a different capture of the moment, proponents, companies have the opportunity to build resilience by helping communities self-empower. So by saying that, I'm denoting ownership within the community. Now the risk is that the community actually does things without the consent, the endorsement, the channeled thinking directed and governed by the company. Yep, that's a risk. Well, but that's what it's all about. And I think that when that risk is actually converted into social return on investment, and you use the tools to measure the return, not just economically, but also including heritage and also including culture. If you go and build a project in Bhutan, Bhutan is well known for they will insist that you actually provide some understanding to the government and the people about triple bottom line, 4 bottom lines, 5 bottom line, quinary. But when you do that, you will know that after you've abstracted water from a mine, you'll know the value of turfing it down a creek bed versus building a plant and selling it as drinking water 200 kilometres down the road, employing people and value adding and so on. And when you do your social return on investment, you might no longer turf that water down the creek bed. That's the point here. So when communities are self-empowered with the company helping them, not just about programs that the company thinks up or or a committee dreams up, but it's true social return on investment which links into some framework around, your 5 pillars of capital, your natural, your people, your built infrastructure, and social and the others. And then you put as we know, your lead and lag indicators around that in a very social engagement with the community, where the community owns it, and the community actually writes onto the website the case studies rather than the corporate comms fellas in head office. That's when the difference is.
And you say that that's how you can safeguard your best intentions becoming your second best intentions, and people say, hey, well, you paid these great wages, but you've created this inequality in the community. You've built this housing, but you've put it in the wrong place. You've built these schools and health services, but this is not what we needed.
Well, there was in 2007, I went to 2 operations in Colombia. Cerrejón, which at the time was the largest open-cut coal mine in the world, and a nickel operation at Cerro Matoso. The guy running the community relations at Cerrejón was the deputy former defence minister of Colombia. So it was guns, bulletproof cars, high security, very big picture, something out of a Bruce Willis sort of movie. Very tight. Relocation had still going on with problems. 7 years relocating. No one was happy. It was complete fracture of relationship with the Cerrejón management. Down the road, same country, none of this, you know, shroud to help you, prevent you being kidnapped and guns and all the rest of it. Some sleepy driver picks you up and you go to a community, absolutely happy. Who's running community relations? Someone who in his chip loves people. Oh, what a difference. Actually has an outreach, loves people, management listens to him. He's there for a number of years. He's grooming the next person to come along to actually be in that seat. And their resettlement program is where the families were listened to. So I'm talking about 51% listening here in engagement. They were listened to, and if they had a disabled member, well, the house was reconfigured to work with a wheelchair of that person. Completely different with Cerrejón, and the Cerro Matoso people just gave it all high five.
We'll hear from Helen first, if that's okay, and then John, because I know that you want to jump in earlier, Helen.
Well, I guess you're probably going to follow on from that comment, but I think the other thing from our perspective is, you know, the work that Australian mining companies do overseas is commendable, and we've got, you know, lots of good examples of that. But I think what we're saying is that they're, in a sense, the governments of countries where mining companies are going into shouldn't be allowed to get off the hook either. And part of the reason that we've taken that focus on inequality and what has to happen in terms of addressing inequality is that there is a global issue around taxation and regulation that has to be looked at. There has to be some mandatory rules to actually require that countries do disclose what benefits should be going to their communities, and that mining companies should do that, and that it's not just up to the mining companies to fix up HIV or maternal health services or other systems that have gone wrong in countries. It's actually up to governments to take responsibility for that. And from our perspective, because in particular we see so much good practice from the Australian mining company industry, we're in a sense saying you're in a great position to argue, certainly for this country, that we have much more mandatory transparency around disclosure and around tax and around profit shifting. Australia is going to host the G20. We've got a treasurer who's talking about tax one way or the other. We're not quite sure how he's going to lead, but this is a really great opportunity for Australia to say we need global tax justice, and it's not just up to the mining companies to fix up the problems that are systemic or inherent in many of these countries. We've got to have other levers to pull to actually address our concern, which is this growing inequality and the poverty that results from that.
Meanwhile, John, we were talking about this tactile level of how do you ensure that your best intentions deliver the best results?
It's a very interesting point that Ford raised on who actually is the front face involving with communities. And I think in the past, and the discipline of corporate affairs is the same, it was sort of a special project sort of holding pen. If you weren't working out in engineering or you weren't being a very good accountant and we really didn't want to get rid of you because it was too much of a hassle, hang on, why don't you go and head up corporate affairs for a while? Or better still, look, we've got a vacancy out as community liaison. Sure, defence isn't a great match, but you know we've got to put you somewhere. The redundancy's so high, so why don't you set that up? And I think one of the things that we're looking at in Anglo-American is a people's way. So, for example, there's engineers' people's way, accountants' people's way. There's also now a corporate affairs people's way. So you've got people who are involved with communities. There's a protocol and a structure that you really do need these certain skills if you're going to be our face in the communities. And it's not it's not that you're good at security. You actually need to have an understanding of the community you operate in. You need to have an understanding of what they need, and you need to live the values that the company has and use the tools, which goes on to the next bit I was going to say, Ellen, which is you need to have a toolbox, a social economic assessment toolbox, where all these projects go into, where you consult with the community, and out the other end comes a benefit for not only the community but for the company as well. And you know, we've all seen white elephants, we've all seen, you know, dams where there are no rivers. And what the community wants is proper involvement, but it also wants an outcome that's going to benefit them.
Dick, talk to me about some of those real-world examples you wanted to bring to this conversation.
Yes, Ellen, and I do. While I certainly agree with Helen's Oxfam's principles, I do hesitate a little in thinking that a mining company can influence the tax regime of a country. I think that the mining company can show its right attitudes in relation to entering into the agreements with the country, and then at the different level, what I term the coalface level, with the local communities once it starts planning, constructing, operating the mine in the long term, and must continue to relate to the local communities through the stakeholder groups and show true resilience, because as Ford has pointed out, in time the conditions will change, and that will mean that the communities should have the right to continue to discuss the agreements. What was mentioned, one project that I would like to suggest as a case study, it was suggested that the mine closes and that causes significant devastation locally. The local people have been trained to work in the mine, and they work in the logistics area, the support area, and a case in point is the mine town in PNG supporting the Octetti gold and copper mine of Taboobal, which is a very remote area close to the border with Indonesia in the western province of PNG, and it was prior to the mine, when BHP first developed the mine, it was a town of 400 or so in a very remote rural area. It is now something well in excess, as I understand it, of 20,000 people. It has a good airport, it has a hospital, very good communications, filtered and treated water and a sanitation system. It's got schools. It's got some very good housing.
And now it's all going to go.
And in about 5 years, the mine will close. It will be finished. But the the miner OTML, which is government owned, and the government recognised this, fortunately, and showed true vision, and commissioned consultants to look at what might be done in every aspect of that town, covering governance and security and the physical infrastructure that's been provided, and the location and the well-being of the people, and the industries that are there, because quite a few industries have grown up to support the mine. And a very far-reaching, and the cost of running the town of Taboobal is something like $40 million US dollars annually, and that's certainly not insignificant.
And so, what are the prospects for a place like that?
Well, one prospect was certainly was and is to walk away and leave it as a very nice ghost town. Yeah. Because it's remote and people won't get there. But what is in fact proposed is it will become an education hub, because it has a hospital and because it has schools. It can train in the medical area. It can accommodate the students who come to train there, because there is very good housing associated with the mine. It can train in straight education and technical education, and it would seem that Taboobal will have a very significant future. I mean, it's quite a remarkable asset for the government of PNG to have such a town set up there, and it would seem that that's going to be used. And I think that's an example of all I'd be interested to hear from John on Anglo-Americans' approach, but all mines come to an end, and there is an example of good governance and good strategy in bringing that town to a useful and productive future, sustainable future.
Are you busy? You could go out to Geelong, have a conversation with them out there.
Yes, well, perhaps the people in Geelong can retain the same consultants and do something there. Well, I shouldn't joke about Geelong. That is a very serious.
Well, it's a similar issue in a very different context, isn't
it?
But
it can work. I mean, we look at Newcastle, and there is Newcastle. When I was young, my brother-in-law was manager of the works in Newcastle. If I'd suggested to him and the people of Newcastle at that stage that, okay, we'll close the steelworks and everything that supports it, you would have been regarded as mad. And there it's closed, and things that have supported it have closed. It is significantly an education hub, but it is also many other things. And so it can be done, and I'm sure the people of Geelong they're pretty tough people. We'll get it right.
I'll hear from our panellists, because each of them has something to say, but can I get you to get your thinking caps on? We've got about 20 minutes between us and morning tea, and so after we hear these comments, I'll come for your questions to the panel.
Can I just qualify? Dick, my point, I think, is that in the context of Australia, it would be good to have mandatory requirements around disclosure and reporting.
I see, yes, not individual
so
companies.
We don't expect you to go and change the tax system in Nigeria. Yes. If you can do that, that'd be good. But, the point really is that there are many levers that have to be pulled to really look at the interests of communities, and it was to acknowledge that mining companies do much good work in how they deal with communities, but there has to be, I guess, other sort of more institutional levers that also start to build that notion of transparency and disclosure, so that that information can be used in countries by civil society groups to say, well, where are the benefits that should be coming to us?
Yes. And you noted the G20 as a good platform.
I went to university in Newcastle when BHP was there, and you never put your washing out on a Sunday because you get all that dust. But
gritty city, huh?
Yeah, it was. But on that, yes, BHP closed it. It has become an educational hub, and it's got the health. But the main industry that is keeping that place going is mining up the valley that shifts the coal out. And I think there's a danger, and going to your second point, Dick, about when things shut down, what happens. I think there is a danger of companies expecting the government just to come in and make it a hub, and expect the population for the government to step in once the mining company is left. The mining company should have a legacy, have left a positive legacy where there can be industry that doesn't need government assistance. That would be a lovely thing to have. Governments don't generate wealth. It's the communities themselves that are able to generate it, and it's industry. And I think that's something that our sector has to look at.
Yeah. If we, all of us may remember Ravensthorpe, and because of a downturn in the commodity price in October 2008, after a walk-up start to have something built over, let's say, if you include the study period, 10 years, but call it 8 probably, in terms of visibility of around psychological contracts with the community and governments being made, 8 years in and now no second out. Now, that's, I think, where we're coming together at. You just don't abandon in that way. And whereas, the car industry, yes, we're talking about Geelong, but as my understanding, I don't live in Geelong, and therefore I'm not close to what's happening in the opportunity of a few years' notice. But it's a few years' notice as I understand it, and the same with Elizabeth in South Australia. That to me lies in contrast to, commodity price, now we're going to pull a pin on this, and we're talking big, large-scale players, large-scale projects. I mean, you don't do that, and it does happen.
Okay, I have a question here. If anybody else has a question, we have another microphone on this side of the room. And morning tea's not ready, so we'll have to keep talking.
Jeff Hart from the Australian Africa Mining Industry Group. Not so much a question, but a comment. Helen mentioned government in the G20 context. Or perhaps forgive me if I can go back one step. The discussion we've had this morning, extremely interesting discussion I might say, or commentary, is nonetheless of course about paradigms, how to do things best. When you look at Africa, we know that there are many, many impediments to doing many of these things well. And clearly the impact of any particular mining company in terms of its influence on central government can often be limited. For that reason, some of the sorts of programs that in fact we, from an Australian, when I say we, the Australian government has been doing in Africa, the training programs, mining governance, have and are very important in making a contribution to improving the capacity of African governments to effectively engage with the mining companies to produce the sort of outcomes that we're talking about today. And I think it's important in discussing these issues to recognise that notwithstanding the challenges that our own government believes they face now in the budgetary context, there are still very many important things which only government can do. A mining company can't go to a central government and say, we'd like some of your people to go and learn better about how to manage this sector, because then all of us will be better off. Only governments can do that sort of thing. So there is still a very important role, I think, for the Australian government in helping to facilitate this process of effective corporate and social responsibility, and one hopes that some of these elements will be retained in the longer term. It's in everyone's interest. We now talk about an Australian aid program focused on the national interest. Well, this sort of work is focused on the national interest because it enables Australian mining companies to better position themselves in their relations to everyone's benefit.
I've noted in Canada, in the Northwest Territories, 3 companies and government and people, I should have said, sorry, the community, government and 3 companies collaborate well together. I think if I recall it's BHP, Billiton, De Beers and Rio Tinto together have brought on a considerable positive social investment as distinct from programs. Positive investment that addresses cultural, training, future, jobs, Indigenous people, and I think it's globally a very good model of the collaboration that you're threading into your comments. And in Africa, if as ideal and puristic this may sound, if we could just get a little bit better on working together where proponents and private enterprise collaborate in the sort of example I'm referring to in Canada, rather than having separate swimming lanes, one either side of the pool and not actually seeing much of each other because of, pseudo-competition in the resources sector. That would benefit the community, and I think the community actually expects companies to collaborate and bring together a more firepower to help their responsibility to self-empower.
But I'd like to say I think you've made a really important comment at this time where we're really waiting to see, I suppose, where our kind of international aid and development interests are going to lie with a change of government. And, just to kind of put some more flesh on the bones of your point, I think there's about 250 Australian companies that operate in Africa. We've heard a lot about the issue of aid for trade and, what actually constitutes the national interest. And I think the way that you've talked about the way governments can talk to each other is a really good example of how Australia can make an investment. The Australian government, through its aid program, can make an investment that does align with our trade interests, that does align with an economic paradigm, but still has the concerns, I suppose, of reducing poverty and dealing with the ability of communities to speak up. So I hope your voice is somewhere in the system at the moment being heard, because it's a really excellent example. And what we've heard is, I think, a concern that we might be withdrawing attention from Africa, except for maybe the east coast of Africa, and in terms of our aid budget, and there's a much bigger picture that needs to be painted and a different perspective that needs to be put on how that investment actually helps Australia as well as helping those countries. So thank you very much for your comment.
I think it shouldn't be overlooked that the mining companies do leave a legacy in the infrastructure in which they build, and they do it, you could say, for their own selfish interests, but the community benefits. The Highlands Highway in Papua New Guinea is a lifeline to the very major population centre. It is a very difficult road because of the geology. It has landslips, and Barrick Gold operate a big mine, and they fund the emergency repairs. The Department of Works does the basic maintenance of the road, but if there's a landslip, then there is a fund which Barrick fund to repair. In Tanzania, we did a project with, again, it was with Barrick and bringing power into our mine, and because we were able to establish cogeneration and greatly reduce the cost of the power, they then provided power to a significant number of communities in the area. And looking at Africa generally, it's going through a road building boom, because the number of roads, if you consider it in the terms of kilometre per million of population, it's probably the figure that I've seen is somewhere down around 100 kilometres per million, which is about an eighth of the world average. It's very poor. But the road building boom in Africa is being led largely by mining companies, and some of them aren't good roads because they might cut across land which shouldn't be affected by roads that they should stay clear. But nevertheless, it is creating the opportunity for trade and movement of people and employment and the like. So there are significant legacies.